Hey, it's Greg here with MaritimeGardening.com, and today I'm going to show how I make sourdough bread. I mentioned that I make it in a previous video, and then people said, show us how you do it. So that's what I'm going to do. So to make sourdough bread, of course, you have to have sourdough starter. There's two ways to do that. You can get it from someone that you know that has it. It's the easiest way. Or you can just start the starter yourself, which is what I did. So how I made my own starter is I had some, I just got these instructions off online years ago. I don't remember what website I got this from. It's some rye flour from the bulk food store, and I put a cup of it in a container with a cup of water, and I stuck it on top of my fridge. And then after 3 days, I took half a cup of that mixture out and tossed it, added a half a cup of rye flour, half a cup of water, left that there for about 2 more days. And then the next day I changed it again. I took half a cup of the starter out and tossed it and added half a cup of rye flour. This isn't a half cup, this is a cup. Half a cup of rye flour and half a cup of water. I left it for a day. After about a week or so of doing that, the mixture becomes bubbly and foamy and has a yeasty smell. Once you've got it there, once it's doing that, which takes about a week, maybe 2, really depends on the temperature of your house, the temperature of where you have it stored, and also just how much yeast is floating around in the air and is present in the flour that you chose. I think I recall the suggestion of using rye flour because it's less processed, so there's more yeast existing in the rye flour. I'm not exactly sure if that's true, but it worked for me, makes good bread, I'm happy with it. So that's how I got my starter going. There's lots of resources online on how to make your own starter. So I got started here, right? And so I tried to use it once a week. Sometimes I make bread, sometimes I make pancakes, sometimes I make waffles, sometimes I make tea biscuits. I use it for different things, but I also make bread once a week. So what I'm going to do here is the first step. Making bread, sourdough bread, it's not a quick thing. It doesn't take up a lot of your time, but it takes time for everything to happen. You're growing something. That's why it's an ideal subject for maritime gardening. You're growing yeast, right? So it does take time, and you sort of have to be patient about it. That's probably why, buying just, the dried yeast in a store is probably a faster way to make bread. But the flavor is different with the sourdough, and of course you're not dependent on buying anything. You're just keeping it going on your own, right? So first thing we do, at least the first thing I do, is I make my next batch of starter. I take half a cup of this rye flour. Don't have to use rye, it's just I remember reading it makes a good yeast, so that's what I use. And then I take half a cup of the starter, okay, and half a cup of water. I just leave that on the counter for about an hour, and that's the starter for whatever I do next time. I'm going to use this for my bread, okay? So what do I got here? I leave this on the counter for about an hour so that it can just sort of get going, and then I put it in the fridge and leave it there until the next time I do something, right? So you're always taking some out, adding some, right? But that's how you keep your starter going. There's different ways to do it, different theories on that, whatever, right? All right, so I'm just going to leave that off to the side. I'm going to use this to make my bread. All right, get rid of that. So now I'm going to make 2, a lot of these YouTube videos where they make bread, they make 1 loaf, which probably makes sense if you live alone, but I've got, a spouse and 2 kids. So making 1 loaf of bread that can evaporate in 1 meal in my family. So I always make at least 2, and I'm going to make 2 today in this recipe. So the general ratio is for every loaf of bread, you need 1 cup of water, right? So I've got 2 cups of lukewarm water. If you're new to all of this and you've got trepidation about, is it too hot, is it too cold? The easiest way is to put whatever the volume of water you're trying to make lukewarm, 1/3 boiling, 2/3 just cold tap water sort of thing, cold, will get you lukewarm, which is what this is, right? It's the temperature of a body. So I got 2 cups of lukewarm water. I'm going to add that to my yeast. Remember, this just came out of the fridge, so it's cold. So yeast isn't as active when it's cold as when it's warm. So we're sort of waking it up. We're saying, hey, come on, wake up, get active, start doing yeasty things, right? We're waking our yeast up, getting it going. All right. I like to do this so I can get it all out of this container, right? Get everything, all the little bits. It's just a simple way. You got to clean the container anyway. So why not, combine that with getting as much starter as you can. The more starter you put in your mix, the more just the quicker your bread's going to happen, right? Because you've got yeast here, and it's going to get involved with your flour, and it's going to start multiplying. Well, if you start off with more, you're going to have more. That's just a simple math sort of thing, right? So, I mean, this is a good thing to do if you've got, on a Saturday or a Sunday, if you have the day off, and you're sort of around the house. You don't have to be standing over to do anything. I would normally do this while I'm making breakfast. What I'm about to do right now, I would do while I'm making breakfast. It would take 5 minutes to do, right? Everything's taking longer because I'm explaining everything right now. All right, so I got that. I'm going to put that in my bowl. See if I got most of it out of there. Yeah, I got most of that out. So now I've got this sort of yeasty, watery stuff in there. Let's get a spoon or something here. That'll do. Stick. Okay, so now I'm done with this rye flour here. I find for 2 loaves of bread, you want about 1/4 cup of oil, vegetable oil. It seems to just make the bread a little softer. The oil's not necessary. And you could use butter, you could use all kinds of different fats, right? Any kind of fat. It's going to make the bread a little softer. But it's not essential for the bread to be bread, not at all. Okay, so we got that, and now I'm going to add some salt. You're going to put a teaspoon of salt for every loaf of bread, so I'm going to put 2 teaspoons of salt in here, just eyeballing it. You can put less salt in. I like a good, I would say even a 1/2 teaspoon would work, but I like a teaspoon of salt for a loaf. I think it just makes the bread taste better. That's me. I like salt. All right, so there's that. Now we're going to add some flour. So for every cup of water, I'm going to add 2 cups of flour, okay? It's not going to be done. We're going to add more as we go, but we're going to start there, right? So I'm going to get a bag of flour here. Don't buy little wimpy bags of flour. Buy the 20 kilogram bag. Save some money. So 1, 2, 3, 4. Now this is the point where you'd normally add a bit of molasses to the bread. If you were going to add something like that, maybe a tablespoon per loaf. So 2 tablespoons is what I would add here. I was going to do that, but I'm all out of molasses. So I'm just not going to bother. It's going to be, you don't need sugar in your bread for it to be bread, right? It's not necessary. Sometimes I like that nice brown molasses bread. But anyway, I'm not going to bother with it this time. It's just going to be just flour, salt, and water, and the sourdough. All right, so that's still quite sticky, right? It looks like a porridge right now. It's got the consistency of a very thick porridge. So I'm going to add another. You want to keep mixing this till it comes away from the bowl. Sort of forms a ball. So I'm going to add a 1/2 cup of flour. I'm just using regular white flour. It's the kind of thing you'd have, right? There's lots of different, with this recipe, you can use, whole wheat flour, rye flour, whatever you've got. I guess technically there's a bit of rye flour here because it was in the starter, but you can use whatever you've got. Just understand that very few things are going to rise as well as the just regular white flour. It's the most refined flour, and it tends to behave. If you're a new novice, I would start there. I would start with white flour. It's cheapest stuff, and you can use it for the most different things, and it behaves the best when you're making bread. I think that's probably good. See how it's come away? You just keep adding a little bits of flour until it starts behaving like this, stop sticking to the bowl, which is where we are, okay? So all you got to do now is cover this and put it somewhere warm. But you don't have to cover it. What I'm going to do is, basically you want to keep it warm, and you want to let it rise, or let it sort of rest, I guess, for about anywhere from 30 minutes to an hour. And then you're going to take it and knead it and mess around with it and stuff like that, and let it rise a second time. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put this in my oven, and I'm going to put a bowl of hot tap water underneath it in the oven, just to create this perfect yeast environment. Oh, let me show you, okay? All right, so here I am with the oven, and yeah, I mean, a lot of these recipes, they'll say cover it with plastic wrap. What a waste of plastic. You don't need that. What you want to do is keep it from drying out, and you want to keep it warm. So to me, you've got this nice insulated environment in your kitchen that you paid a lot of money for. So I put the dough on the top rack. I put about 4 cups of the hot tap water on the rack below. That's enough heat to warm this whole environment, right? Almost like it's sitting on your belly, right? And I'm just going to leave it like that for about anywhere from 30 minutes to an hour. It's not going to rise that much, but it's just resting right now, right? So you just leave it. All right, so it's been about an hour since I put that just in the oven. Of course, the oven wasn't on, right? I just put it in the oven because it's a nice warm place. So let's take her out. All right, so it's increased in bulk a little bit, but not that much, and that's normal. After an hour, not much is going to happen. All you're really doing is you're allowing the flour to hydrate and the yeast to wake up. And by letting it rest for that amount of time, at least half an hour, ideally an hour in my opinion, it makes the dough much easier to work when you're kneading, which is what I'm about to do now. So you get the dough, just flour your counter, right? Get the dough out of there. I like using a wok spatula for this, but anyway, I'm just using a tablespoon here. Okay, comes out okay. All right, so this dough right now is what I would call very wet. And the process of kneading is, of course, you're stretching and massaging and moving the stuff around, and you're activating the gluten in the flour, and bread's all about gluten. If you've got a gluten allergy, you kind of, you don't get to enjoy that. But anyway, I find it's easier to take the flour for the kneading and at least divide it in half. Just eyeball it. Remember, this is a 2-loaf recipe. You can even divide it in quarters for that matter if it makes it easier. Maybe you've got arthritis or something like that. If the ball is about the size of about the size of your hand, it's easier to knead. So just roll it around in that flour so it's not sticky anymore. That's still a quite wet dough. But the kneading process is about doing all that stretching of the dough, activating the gluten, while trying to keep the dough as moist as possible, okay? So that's all we're doing here. We're just, gonna knead it. Maybe each ball will do maybe 20 times. Like you're kind of rolling it over. See how I went like that? Roll, like that. So about 20 times per ball. Right? Not a big deal. Just throw that back in there. Right? So after, I'm going to lose count here because I'm talking, but I'm just assume it's around 20 times, right? After you've done this kneading process, you're going to put it back in that nice, warm, moist environment. Let's get rid of that spoon. for anywhere from 3 to 6 hours, really. It takes a while for this dough to really, get all the yeast to start acting on all the flour and for everything to start happening. And then once that 3 or 4 hours is over, then you shape it into loaves and you wait for them to rise, which takes as long as it takes. And then you put them in the oven. That's the general process, right? I'm hoping I did around 20. The great thing about making bread like this is you get to leave the mess on the counter because, at some point we're going to take this out and knead the whole thing all over again. We're going to have to make another mess. So there's no point in cleaning this mess up. So I kind of like leaving a mess. 7, 8, 9. Notice I'm just adding as much flour as I need. I'll put my hands here. If I feel like the dough is sticking to my hands, I'll just put my hands on the flour and go back to kneading. If I feel like the dough is sticking to the counter, I'll bring a little bit of dough or bring a little flour in. Right? So I'm kneading this and I'm just adding as much dry flour to the equation as is needed to keep this from sticking, but no more. Right? The more flour the drier your loaf is, the less, the more firm it's going to be, the more dense it's going to be. So there's a perfect ratio, right? Somewhere around 2 to 1, 2 parts flour to 1 part water. We're already over that. We're about 2.5 to 1, I guess. So somewhere around there, you got the nice ratio for nice, soft, springy flour. Okay, let's say that's 20. But yeah, the general idea is if it's sticking to the counter, add a little bit of flour. If it's sticking to your hands, put your hands in the flour, rub them together, go back to that, right? That's all you got to do. Okay, that's about 20 times each. That's all you got to do for that. So I'm just going to put the oven still nice and warm, even though I'm not going to recharge that. There's just the whole area is warm. It's as warm as it needs to be for this to rise. Also, I've had my hands in it. It's getting the heat from my hands, right? So, and I can feel, this is warm. It's going to stay warm in there. It's already warm in there. So I'm just going to put it back in there. And I'm going to leave it there. So it's around 10:30 in the morning right now. I'm going to go outside, do some stuff with my kids. And I'll check back and see, what you really want to do is keep an eye on it and see if it's risen at all. You can midway through, like we're around 12 o'clock, I'm going to come in for lunch. It's, even after it's been rising for an hour and a half, it's worth giving it another quick knead. You don't have to, but you can give it another quick knead midway through just to get things going, but you don't have to. Bare minimum right now is you've given it a knead, you put it back in the oven, or you put it somewhere warm where it can stay warm. You can leave it on the counter if if your house is warm. Find some way to keep it from drying out, right? You can put plastic over the top. You can just put another bowl over the top. You can put another plate over the top, right? But what you're doing right now is letting it rise and letting all that yeast come alive and just get the whole bread process going, right? And that takes, it can take 2 hours, 3 hours, 4 hours. Really depends on a lot of things. That's the thing about sourdough bread. There's a lot of things you're just not in control of. I find generally it'd take about 3 hours for my yeast in this situation using this approach with this flour. I'm throwing in all these caveats because it's different for everybody, but that's the general rule, right? So I'll see you in about 3 hours. Okay, so it's been about 3 hours, so we're going to take this out, have a look. And as you can see, it's gotten very big and there's good warmth here. I can feel it. It feels like, when you, put your hand on somewhere someone's been sitting or whatever, it's got that, body warmth. So it's still warm in there. It's still warm almost 3.5, 4 hours after I put that bowl of warm water in the oven. So, this is a modern oven. It's very well insulated. So that's not bad for putting 4 cups of tap warm water in the bottom of an oven. Still warm. All right, so we got our flour here. And let's take her out. Oh, she's stuck on a little bit, that's okay. Get the old wok spatula. Get her all out. Doesn't matter that it's stuck on. There. How hard was that? All right, so very soft flour, very springy. We're going to put some flour here. We're going to get some flour in the hands. Move it around a little bit. Where's my thing? Started baking without having my, I don't know what this is called, pastry knife maybe? Yeah, if you're going to get into making bread, get one of these things. Really, really handy. So instead of using your hands, right, because sometimes things get a bit sticky, you can use this to get underneath it, flip it over like that, right? Right, it's just a handy tool for this stage of things, especially when your flour is very moist, which this is. Okay, so I got, you know, just move it around like that and get enough flour on it so that it's not sticking to your hands, right? You'll know because it just doesn't want to stick anymore. That's good. So that's nice. So now I got that cut into a nice circle, right? So what I'm making 2 loaves of bread here. So I'm going to cut the circle in half as perfectly as I can. And then I'm going to cut the half in half as perfectly as I can. Right? Just eyeballing it. Okay, so now I got 4 halves. All right, just going to move that around the flour a bit. All right, just arrange that around a bit. Very moist, very soft, very springy, and very warm. All right, we got those all ready. We're going to knead those and shape them into loaves. Now I'll show you a number of different techniques for doing this, depending on what you're going for, all right? Now, over the Christmas holidays, I was making the bread, all my bread. I wanted everything to look old-timey, so I was making, you know, what people might call artisanal loaves of bread or that sort of thing. My wife was complaining and she said she wants rectangle bread. So she likes the way it fits in the toaster and all that sort of stuff. So I'll show you all of those techniques, but eventually it's all going to go in these, all right? Now if you're going to, you know, be putting it in a pan like this, you're going to need to grease the pan with something. I can't find. Normally use a brush to grease them, but you can use your fingers. It's no big deal. This is vegan margarine. I'm not vegan, but that's the only kind of margarine I can get that's dairy-free. My wife and I both have that problem. So that's our solution. The other thing you can do is use lard, I guess, right? But yeah, if you're a butter person, you can use real butter. I would use that because it just gets a nice buttery crust and the flavor's good, right? This stuff is not, you know, it doesn't even come close to butter in the flavor department, I would say. It's just better than nothing if you like having a little, you know, butter on your toast, and you can't really break free of that that programming, which I can't. Anyway, so we'll grease these pans up here. Right, you get the general idea. There's techniques, and I've played around with them. There's techniques you can use for making bread without greasing your pans, but I find it's more reliable to just grease them with something. Yeah. And this vegan stuff works, but any kind of fat's going to work, generally speaking. All right, so I got 2 pans. That's what we're going to make. But let me first start just showing you how to do the sort of artisanal loaf that you might think. So I'm going to take 2 of these halves, right, put them together. And what you would do, I don't want to over knead this. It's kind of hard to do, I guess. But you'd knead it. And then roll it around the flour a bit. So you want to knead it at least 20 times at this stage. Anyway, what you do for that approach is you take the bread and you sort of pull it into a center. Make it into a kind of ball. And there's a degree of tension. And you just flip it over. Okay, so you've stretched it, right? You basically, I'm going to show you that again. So you got your dough, right? You got some flour on there. Your hands are floured. And you're just stretching it, right? You're stretching it, stretching, right? Stretching it, pulling it back, right? And then you're sort of pinching it together on the bottom, right? Pinching it there. Right, you've stretched the surface and you're going to flip it over. And you put that on a pan, right? And then you'd score it a number of times on top, right? And you put that in your pan, right? Then you let it rise and you bake it, right? If you're going to do that sort of thing. If you wanted to have like more like a French loaf, you know, or an Italian style loaf, you flatten this out like you're making a pizza, okay? Okay, trying to make it a little bit oblong. Doesn't have to be perfect. Sticking a little bit here, so okay, a little bit oblong, so you can see that's kind of an oval to a certain extent. Okay, hope that's coming across on video. And then you just roll it up like that, and then you pinch the seam. Keep your fingers floured. Pinch the seam down. Right, put a bit of flour down. Put that pinched seam down. Right, then you have your nice rolled loaf, and you score that. I like to go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Right, middle and middle sort of thing. Right, and then you put that on your pan, and you'd leave it to rise. You know, probably take about 2, 3, 4 hours, depending on the situation. But today, since I've already rolled this one, let's do this one that way. So you can just put that on a cookie sheet, let it rise and bake it, and you'll get like an old-timey looking loaf. You could even put cornmeal underneath it, so it's almost like an Italian bread, right? Or you can just pop it in a pan like this, and it'll rise and it'll be a rectangle bread, right? The other way to do it is you've got the two halves of a loaf, right? And actually, I can't put that in there because I haven't kneaded it properly. Idiot. All right, let's knead this properly. All right, so let's knead that. I'm just doing a rough count here. 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21. The minimum is 20. I'm going to go 30. 3, 4, 25, 26, 27, 28, 29, 30. And you can just keep going. Depends on how angry you are and how much frustrations you need to work out. But 20 is minimum, 30 is good, right? We'll do this two different ways. I'll use that oval technique I just showed you, okay? Then you roll that up, pinch the seam, right? Boy, it smells very bready in here. I haven't even baked anything yet, right? Kind of bring it together, eyeing up the size of the pan, right? And then score, middle, half middle, end sort of thing. I don't know, that's my technique. Flap it around in the pan, okay? That's one. Another technique is to have a lot of, if you go to a lot of bakeries, or if you're at like one of those bake sales, or crafty flea market where people sell baked goods, the type of loaf I'm going to show you right now is what a lot of people do. So you've got your two halves of a loaf, give it a good kneading. 6, 7, 8, 9, 11, 12, 13, 14. I find it so much easier to knead when it's in a half loaf like this. It's probably why people started making loaves that way. Just because it's about the size of your hand, right? You can really manipulate it well. You can get your weight on it. I mean, this stuff looks hard, but it's really, once you get the hang of it, it's a piece of cake, unless you've got, arthritis or some sort of physical problem. Okay, so now I've got a well-kneaded ball, right? There's one. I'll do the other one. People that don't make bread by hand, I know in the 90s and 80s and 90s and early 2000s, bread makers were just all the rage. And I wouldn't be surprised if a good portion of them are in the trash right now. I don't know. I think if you're in reasonably good shape, this is not a big deal to do. You don't have to do it every day. And I find making about 2 loaves is not too overwhelming. It's not too big a task, right? Really, you know, to make 2 loaves of bread on a day where I'm off and around the house probably takes about 30 minutes out of my day. That's not a big deal for fresh bread. All right, so those 2 are nicely kneaded. Now, for these 2 halves of the loaf, I'm going to use the same technique that I showed you for that circle bread. We're going to sort of fold it in. Pull, stretch, and fold. Stretch and fold. Right? I'm just starting to stick here. That's good. Okay, now I'll pinch that together. All right, that's good. A little flour there, a little flour there. Give it a score. That's it. Put it in the pan. All right, do the same thing. It feels like this side's a bit bigger than the other side, to tell you the truth. Anyway, I'm going to do that same thing. Stretch, fold. Stretch, fold. Stretch, fold. Just seems to rise better when you use that technique for shaping the loaf up. All right, let me just pinch that together. Flip it over so get that nice sort of smooth looking top. Give it a score and put it in the pan. So now I got these 2 things here like that, right? So these are about half the height of the pan. So I'll know they're ready when they're appearing either at or slightly above profile on that pan, right? They're roughly a rough gauge of them being doubled in size. And that should happen in 2 or 3 hours. Might take more, might take less. On any given day, you just don't know what's going to happen with sourdough bread. That's just the way it goes. So now I just stick that back in my little incubator and leave it go for a couple hours. One little trick you can do, which I didn't do with this loaf, which I should mention, is that if you make the sourdough bread and you find it's a bit sour, that's just acidity, right? You can add maybe half a teaspoon of baking soda per loaf. Okay, it's not going to help it rise that much because the baking soda will react with the acidity, but it'll tone down the acidity, right? It'll just neutralize it a little bit. So if you're making the bread and people are kind of got a funny look on their face when they're eating it because you're not used to eating sourdough bread. I mean, some people love the taste of sourdough bread, but some people are turned off by it. Then you just put like half a teaspoon of baking soda, not powder, per loaf, and that should neutralize and tone down that sourness, that acidity, okay? So anyway, I'm gonna let that sit for a bit. I'll see you in a few hours. We'll see. It's gonna be 2-3 hours before these are ready to be baked. All right, so it's been about 4.5 hours since I put those in the incubator, the oven, to rise. Let's have a look. So they've at least doubled in size. They're not exactly flush with the top, but very close. And just because of what's going on in my life right now, this is the time to turn the oven on. They've at least doubled in size, okay? So right now I'm gonna take take that bowl of water that I put in the oven, I don't know, hours ago, out. I'm gonna put these back in the oven. Gonna turn the oven on for 40 minutes at 400 degrees. That's easy to remember. So bake 400. I'm gonna set my old school timer for 40 minutes. All right? We'll see you in 40 minutes and have a look at these loaves. I should also mention that, you know, the recipe I used, you can change that. You can add, for each loaf of bread, you can add about a tablespoon of molasses. You can add, You can change out some of the flour component for whole wheat flour, rye flour, different kinds of flour. You know, just understand that the greater proportion of the flour that you use that is not just white, enriched, all-purpose flour, it's most likely the less rise you're going to get, the more dense it's going to be, and that sort of thing. The flour that rises the most and it's the softest and all that sort of stuff is just your regular enriched white flour. Every other kind of flour, they're all nutritious, they're all good for you and all that sort of stuff. But just I'm telling you this so you can understand and manage your expectations and that sort of thing. Every other kind of flour, while it has, you know, better properties in terms of your health and nutrition and vitamins and all that sort of stuff, you know, most of them are not going to rise the way that enriched white flour does. Just so you understand that. I use various ratios of all kinds of different things. But yeah, if I'm having company over and I want a nice, fluffy, soft, luxurious sort of effect, I just use the enriched white flour. If I want it to be a brown bread, I'll add about a tablespoon of molasses per loaf to get that effect. All right? Anyway, we'll see you in 40 minutes. All right, so it's been 40 minutes. Let's pull these out of the oven and see what we're dealing with here. All right, so they've both risen to the extent that they're above profile, right? Even though they were a bit below that when we popped them out. When you pull these out of the oven, immediately you want to get them out of the pan, they'll sweat in the pan. You want to get them breathing. Get the, you know, they still have water, moisture in them. You want to get that water out. How do you know your bread is done? I mean, if you use my technique, you put it in a cold oven. If I didn't make this clear when I put them in the oven, you put them in a cold oven, you turn the oven to 400, you have it on for 40 minutes, okay? Cold oven, 400, you set it to 400, you leave it in there for 40 minutes. When they're done, they make that sound. Hard on the top, okay? So these are done, these are fine. You know, nice looking loaf, right? Kind of hot. Now, my advice for fresh bread, despite your desire to cut into it and enjoy it immediately, I would say wait a few hours. I mean, it's 7 p.m. at night near. So I started making this bread when I turned the camera on this morning to begin this video. It was around 9 something in the morning, 9:30 perhaps, when I started this. And now it's about 10 after 7 p.m., right? So what's that, 10 hours? Start to finish, 10 hours, right? Does that mean I was working at this for 10 hours? No, I mean, you know, this video is going to be edited down. It's going to contain the time I spent doing this and talking about it, right? So in terms of the time it takes to make the bread, less than 30 minutes, probably more like 20 minutes. The actual time you spend in the kitchen doing stuff with your hands, but there's a lot of waiting times in between. And I think that's where people get confused about making bread. They think it's time consuming and it's hard. It's time consuming, but it doesn't consume your time. It just takes time, right? If you're around, if you're in their house, just doing stuff, puttering around, doing this, that, and the other thing. I was out with my kids for a couple hours outdoors. I was doing different things today. I was even messing around in the garage, doing some stuff in the garden, you know, just doing all kinds of things, right? You don't have to be in the kitchen the whole time, but you got to be around because you do a little bit of this, you let the bread do its thing. You do a little bit of that, you let the bread do its thing. So now the bread's ready, and you know, it's the evening. I'm just going to let it sit out like this all night. Tomorrow morning, I'm going to cut some of this up for breakfast, and I'll put it in plastic bag or plastic container, that sort of thing, right? But I'm not going to contain this bread until a good amount of time. Bare minimum, I would let the bread out like this on a little, see it's on a rack, breathe for at least 4 hours. I usually make bread first thing in the morning or the end of the day. So if I make it first thing in the morning, it sits out in the rack all day while I'm at work. If I make it in the evening, it sits out all night while I'm asleep, right? The bread needs to breathe. There's still moisture inside the bread, and it needs to just breathe and evaporate and get all that sort of stuff out. So tomorrow morning when I cut into this, it's going to have a pretty hard crust. But once you put it in a bag, the next day, it's softer, but it's still going to be pretty soft. This is going to be a good bread. I can just tell by the way it rose. It has that nice curve on the top, right? If you let the bread rise too long, it doesn't have this shape on the top. It has this shape on the top. So there's a sweet spot about how long you let it rise for. You know, you got to just make a call at some point. So, you know, you can let it rise and let it rise and let it rise, and it'll keep continuing in bulk. But there's some point where when you let it rise in the pan, it doesn't have the right shape when it's actually baked in the oven. So for this one, you know, after I shaped the loaves, 3.5 to 4 hours seemed to work for this yeast, this starter, this flour, and these conditions on this day, right? So I hope I keep stressing that enough. It's you know, it's a bit of an art form in terms of you learning to interpret what the bread's doing and letting the bread tells you what to do, and you do it when it seems to be the right time to do something, you do it. I hope I'm making some sense to some people. I mean, if you're trying this for the first time, use the vague timelines I've suggested. But as you do this, you develop a sense for when, you know, to advance from one stage to the next. You just will. On any given day, things happen a little bit differently. They might be half an hour to an hour ahead of schedule or behind schedule. You just have to make those adjustments as you know. So I hope I'm not making this sound more complicated than it really is. It really isn't. It's a feeling it through process. If you have a garden, you kind of understand that sort of thing, right? You are working on nature's time, and you're just responding to it and facilitating a process. So I hope that made sense. That's how you make sourdough bread. This is how I've been making it for a number of years. It's not that hard. It's not that complicated. It takes a little practice. The more you do it, the easier it gets. Hope you found that interesting. If you did, please like, share, subscribe. Check out my podcast, maritimegardening.com. And until next time, have fun in your garden. Have fun in your kitchen. Thanks for watching.